Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We've been talking a lot about the economy and housing this week, and so I thought it would be interesting to sort of broaden our discussion to Canadian competitiveness. I've been seeing Jock Finlayson post quite a bit and comment lately about competitiveness, and so I thought it'd be great to check in with him. Jock Finlayson is the Senior Fellow and holds the Peter Brown Chair in Canadian Competitiveness at the Fraser Institute, Canada's top-ranked think tank. Previously, he was the Executive Vice President and Chief Economist at the Business Council of British Columbia. Jock, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity, Brian.
My pleasure. So our topic tonight is Canada's competitiveness. And, off the top, how are we doing? How does Canada rank globally in terms of our competitiveness, sir?
Yeah, no, it's an important sort of question to start off with. The best way to describe it is to use the adjective mediocre. Canada is a mediocre performer on most sort of rankings that I've seen regarding our sort of global competitive position. We're not terrible, but we're certainly not a top tier performer. We're sort of in the middle among our kind of peer jurisdictions, the other major advanced economies. So that's the first point. We're a mediocre performer, not a particularly strong performer. And the second thing I would flag is our relative standing has tended to deteriorate over the past sort of 1 or 2 decades. So we've kind of been slipping, not falling steeply, but sort of slipping incrementally in these global rankings, which I think aligns with a lot of other data that we see about the Canadian economy. So it's no real surprise, but it's not a gold medal performance by any means.
So the statistics that I've heard is that, a decade ago, we might have been equal to the United States in productivity, and we're now 40% less than the United States in productivity. Does that make any sense?
There's always been, through my working career anyway, a productivity gap between Canada and the United States. So the U.S. is sort of at the frontier among all the global, competitors in how productive its economy is. We used to be sort of 80 to 90% of the American level, but since the year 2000 in particular, we've really been slipping, and we're down to about 70% of the U.S. level of what we call GDP, or output per hour of work, which is the main measure of productivity that economists use. So we're going in the wrong direction. And the last few years, our productivity is almost completely stagnated. So that's one of the ingredients that goes into the narrative around our eroding competitiveness, is our inability to sort of boost productivity compared to the US and some other countries.
GDP per capita, I understand it may be flat or declining. Is that correct?
Yeah, because our population has been growing much faster than most other developed countries, and because the economy has been sort of limping along, GDP per person has been trending lower in Canada over the past few years, and that'll certainly continue for 2024. And the gap there, that's not quite the same thing as productivity, but it's a kind of related measure of economic prosperity. And that's concerning. The gap with the U.S. on GDP per person is also widening along with the gap on productivity. So we're really losing ground on what I would argue are the most important metrics for long-term economic prosperity. And I think it should be a bigger priority for policymakers than it appears to be at the moment.
Now, most people, when I mention GDP, say, I don't know what the heck GDP is. What are we doing on income? Tell me about median income.
Yeah, ultimately, income levels and income growth are very closely related to both GDP per person and how productive the overall economy is. So although they're different measures, they're pretty tightly correlated. Real incomes in Canada have been, I would say, limping along. They have risen a bit. We've seen tight labor markets that's put upward pressure on wages and salaries, so that's been good for working families. Incomes have gone up, or employment incomes. Obviously, the stock market, particularly the U.S. stock markets, perform well, so that's benefited people who have stock holdings. So incomes are doing a little better than GDP, but in the long run, we're not going to be able to grow incomes unless we can make the economy more productive. That has to be job one.
Are there areas when thinking about competitiveness that we do well in versus areas that we do poorly in, or are they all sort of the same?
No, it's a great question. Canada has historically done, like in the last decade, say, uh, we tended to rank quite highly on what economists call human capital. So the skills and education levels of the population, particularly the working age population, that's been an area that Canada's done well. Now, our performance is eroding there as well, but historically we've been a pretty good performer. Obviously, our natural resource basket is almost unrivaled in the world. So we've got tremendous strengths in terms of energy, mining, forestry, agri-food, water. We've got a huge land mass. We're very abundant in natural resources, and that does play into some of the strengths that we have as a country. And we've got proximity to the United States. For all the problems in the Canada-U.S. relationship and the worries about trade restrictions and all the rest of it, we are pretty tightly integrated with the U.S. economy, and the U.S. is 23% of the world. It's the biggest, richest market in the world, and we have favorable access to it and geographic proximity. So that's a huge advantage for Canada. If we took that away, our situation would be far more dire than it is at the moment.
This is a fascinating conversation, and I think a really critically important one. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Jock Finlayson, who's a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute in Vancouver. He's also the Peter Brown Chair in Canadian Competitiveness. He's a former chief economist of the Business Council of British Columbia, and someone that obviously has a lot of knowledge about what these topics are. We're going to take a 2-minute break, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask him, is this important? Is competitiveness important? And how and why did we get where we are if our performance is so, he says mediocre. I would say, frankly, dismal. Back in 2 minutes, everyone. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Jock Finlayson. He is the Senior Fellow and Peter Brown Chair in Canadian Competitiveness at the Fraser Institute. Our topic is Canadian competitiveness. I wanted to sort of broaden the conversation that we've been having this week in regards to the economy and housing, and really think about Canada's economy and competitiveness overall. And I think we've got the right gentleman to chat with us about it. As I mentioned, he was the chief economist for the ICBA, the largest construction industry association in Canada, the senior fellow at the Fraser Institute, a former executive vice president and chief economist, and then senior advisor to the Business Council of BC, a member of the nominations committee for the BC Business Laureates Hall of Fame, a former member of the board of directors of Invest Vancouver. And it goes on and on and on. He's got really quite an impressive educational background as well. He's got a BA from UBC, an MA from UBC, a BA in political science and economics from UBC, a postgraduate diploma in economics from the University of London, a doctorate of laws from Royal Roads University, and then an MBA from Yale School of Management. So, sir, you've got the credentials. I appreciate you joining us. So I got to ask you, is what you're studying, is what we're talking about, is what you've been posting about on a very frequent basis, competitiveness, is it really important?
In the long run, for sure. It has to do really with business growth and investment. If you have an uncompetitive environment in your jurisdiction, over time, you're going to really struggle in getting companies to invest and in growing your business sector. And, that will eventually show up in terms of stagnating incomes, fewer good job opportunities, sort of limited career prospects for people, et cetera. So it doesn't happen overnight. And Canada, again, we're not you used the word dismal before. I mean, I would say we're sort of middle of the pack in terms of our performance. What's more concerning to me is the kind of U.S.-Canada comparisons, and I'm seeing data that I find quite alarming in terms of the growing gaps in prosperity and sort of career opportunities, business investment activity. And we are integrated with the U.S. We're right next to the U.S. We're part of the North American market, and we need to sort of pull our socks up a little bit, in my opinion, vis-a-vis the United States. Or I think we're really at risk of a kind of accelerating brain drain of talent out of Canada, and maybe companies sort of redeploying their investment away from Canada to the U.S. That's already happening, but the trend could very well accelerate. So those are some of the things that I'm sort of worried about and monitoring, and that I think are relevant to this discussion of Canada's overall competitive position.
So we've been talking about competitiveness for a long time, and I think one of the reasons why we entered into the free trade agreement with the United States back in, what was it, 1988, was to achieve a more competitive economy. I was a follower of the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity, which was an organization in Toronto that was trying to make us more competitive. If we've had all these efforts and we've been talking about it and we've been doing things to become more competitive, why do we have such a dismal, if mediocre, performance?
Why are we not doing better, in other words? And I think it's a puzzle. I wouldn't claim to have all the answer, the full answer to that. I think that's a big question. What I would say is, I think governments, particularly at the national level in Canada, have taken their eye off the ball on this over the past number of years. If you look at the agenda of the current federal government, it's largely driven around a social agenda. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but they're preoccupied with childcare, pharmacare, their climate change policy, housing now. By the way, all these areas are primarily provincial jurisdiction in Canada, so it's a bit of a puzzle why the national government would be putting so much of its time and energy into things that it's not primarily responsible for. But that's what we've seen, under Mr. Trudeau's government. Very little attention, in my opinion, has been paid to improving the business environment in Canada, to making Canada more attractive for growth-oriented businesses. We've done nothing in terms of tax policy to make Canada a more appealing place for talent or for businesses to invest. Just the opposite. We're actually moving in the wrong direction. I mentioned the natural resource industries a few minutes ago. Half of Canada's exports come out of the natural resource industries collectively, and the current federal government has been quite unfriendly to the resource economy. We feel that very acutely out here in Western Canada, and I think you'll see Mr. Trudeau's government do very poorly in this part of the country in the next federal election, partly for the reasons I've just cited. So I think to the extent public policy plays a role, and it does, in helping to influence a jurisdiction's competitive position, we haven't been doing very well. And I think it should be a much higher priority for our leaders to really ask, what do we need to do to attract more investment, up our game on productivity, and make Canada one of the leading global jurisdictions, which is really where we belong, instead of a sort of also-ran, which is currently where we stand.
How do we do that?
We need to have our leaders spend much more of their time, energy, and their political capital on doing things that will improve the sort of structural foundations of the economy. And that does not involve growing government, as we've seen at the federal level. So we've added, the federal public service has exploded in size by 40% during Mr. Trudeau's time in power, and yet federal government services and programs, if anything, have deteriorated. So that's not working. Growing government is not the way, certainly at the federal level, to build a more productive economy. Modernizing the tax system. We haven't had a major overhaul of taxation in Canada for decades. The world's changing rapidly, and we need to sort of modernize, change the architecture of the tax system, reduce some of the compliance burdens and the complexity. I mean, taxation has become so complex that even people who devote their professional careers to working on tax issues have trouble explaining and even understanding the system we have today. So I'd modernize that. We need to move to efficient regulation. It shouldn't take 10 or 12 or 20 years to build a new mine. It shouldn't take 5 years to get approvals for a new logistics warehouse in one of our suburban markets. It shouldn't take 25 years to build new infrastructure in Canada. We've got to streamline and make more efficient all of our project assessment and permitting systems, and we rank very poorly on a global scale in all of those kinds of indicators, Brian. So that's something that is within the power of government to fix. It's not just the federal government either, by the way. The provinces are big players in that as well. Here in my city of Metro Vancouver, in some of our communities here, it can take longer to build a 10-story, get all the approvals and build this 10-story apartment building than it took Canada to fight and win the Second World War. And so we've become a place where it's very, very difficult and cumbersome to build anything. And that's got to change if we want to, up our game on not just competitiveness, but you mentioned housing. I mean, in the early 1970s, we had 22 million people, and we built as many houses then as we did last year with 40 million people. So we're falling so badly short on bringing new housing into market. It's taking so much longer. It's so much more expensive. Why is that? Can't we work on it to improve our performance? So that really links into competitiveness. Our housing prices and costs are among the highest in the world, at least in the major metropolitan areas, when you benchmark them against incomes, median incomes. And that's something that I think is within the power of governments at all levels to improve. So that I would recommend as well as one of the sort of levers we could pull to make Canada more attractive as a place to invest.
How does high housing negatively impact the economy?
Well, it makes it hard to attract and retain talent. I mean, if you're a software developer and you're going to make $100,000 a year, why are you going to locate yourself in a place like Metro Vancouver or the Greater Toronto area, where housing costs, prices, are 10, 11, 12 times median household incomes? If there's other places in the world or even in North America you can go where the ratio between housing prices and median incomes is 4 or 5 or 6. So expensive housing is a deterrent to talent attraction and talent retention. It's fine for old people like me who already own their houses. I've got that asset paid off, and I'm not mobile in my age. But people in their late 20s and 30s, who are the sort of foundation for building successful businesses, they are mobile. And areas like the GTA and Metro Vancouver are becoming tough markets to attract and retain people, especially highly skilled people, partly because of just the high cost of housing, because it isn't that way necessarily in other North American centers.
So some companies in Toronto have found it difficult to recruit people from other places in Canada, Montreal or Calgary or even London, Ontario, et cetera, to move to Toronto to take jobs because of the high price of housing. I think that the Greater Toronto Area, maybe even Ontario, had its first out-migration of a population in Canada, where 44,000 people, I think, left the Greater Toronto Area primarily to go to Western Canada. Do you think that's a negative to our competitiveness?
Well, it's certainly a negative for the Greater Toronto Area. You don't want your young, talented, ambitious, entrepreneurial workforce to up sticks and go somewhere else. If these people are migrating to other parts of Canada, then it's not necessarily a huge net loss to the country. I'm more worried about actually people leaving the country because my observation is that the outflows of people we see to the United States in particular tend to be among our most talented individuals. Our best, engineers, our top managers, our best researchers, some of our most talented entrepreneurs. Those are the people you want to hold on to, and because they play a disproportionate role in building the economy and building successful companies. So I'm more concerned about that than I am about migration within Canada, because if people are moving from Toronto to Calgary, it's a loss for Toronto perhaps, but it's a gain for Calgary. So from a broader Canadian perspective, it might end up being a bit of a wash.
Are there statistics on what the out-migration to the United States, what the brain drain to the U.S. might be?
It's not huge, but it is creeping higher, and it's not so much the sheer number It's who they are. So, for example, there are multiple tens of thousands of Canadians studying right now at American universities, and they're down there, whether they're paying the full tuition or they're on sports scholarships or they're attending the Harvard Business School or whatever. How many of these people come back to Canada once they've completed their education? Because I would argue that they're probably among our most promising, young Canadians. I'd like to see a study of that. There was some work done before COVID that looked at the LinkedIn profiles of people who graduated from computer science programs at our leading universities in Canada. And it showed that 1/4 of the recent graduates, their LinkedIn profiles indicated that they were living and working in the United States after graduating from Canadian universities and benefiting from the sort of taxpayer subsidy that's provided for domestic students. So I think it's something we got to keep an eye on. It's not a crisis. We've always had some brain drain, and we do attract a lot of talent into Canada through immigration, which probably offsets some of the talent outflow that we have vis-a-vis the US. And by the way, we don't attract much talent into Canada from the United States. The flow is sort of one way. It's from north to south rather than from south to north.
Our last Minister of Finance wrote a book, I understand, that criticized our current government that he was part of in the cabinet of not having a growth agenda, having a redistributive agenda, not a growth agenda. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I read, this is Bill Morneau, who was Mr. Trudeau's finance minister from 2016 until he left in 2000, I guess it was 20 or 21, 20, I think. Yeah, it's very unusual to have a finance minister or any cabinet minister write a book critical of the government that he, until very recently, was a key minister in. And I think he has captured quite well in that book the challenge that we've got in Canada around both productivity and economic growth. So he was worried about the long-term prospects for growth in the Canadian economy, and he argued that Mr. Trudeau's government just wasn't seized with that. It was true when he wrote the book, it was true when he was Minister of Finance, and it's true today. So for some reason, and I don't purport to have an explanation for it, but for some reason, the issues that he flagged in his book just don't seem to resonate with the Prime Minister and his cabinet. And I'm not a political person. I can't really give you a convincing explanation why that would be the case. But I do think they're shortchanging the country by focusing almost all their attention on redistribution and encouraging consumption rather than investment, which is where we really need to up our game in Canada.
And is redistribution the social programs that you mentioned earlier, and is a growth agenda the competitiveness efforts that you think we need?
Yeah, I mean, the emphasis, a redistribution agenda is mainly about, dividing up the current income that the economy produces in a different way. And that has certainly been Mr. Trudeau's priority. And his finance minister, Freeland, she's very explicit that that's what she's focused on. Rather than growing the pie, they're sort of, rejigging it a bit. And in the long run, that is not what's going to build prosperity. I mean, some redistribution is necessary in a market economy where you have widely varying kind of outcomes and income levels. So I don't have a problem with that. But policy should be also focused on growing the pie, and particularly growing the pie in a way that makes us more productive in the long run. And I just don't think we're putting enough emphasis on that.
Fascinating conversation about Canadian competitiveness and what we need to do. Number one, whether it's critical, and certainly our guest has suggested it is. And then also, number two, what are we going to do about it? And I think that's where we're going to turn after we take another break for some messages and come back. And I'm going to ask Jock Finlayson, what exactly is it that we need to do to increase and improve our competitiveness so that hopefully all of us can have a higher disposable income? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Jock Finlayson from the Fraser Institute. He's a senior fellow there. He's an expert on competitiveness. He is an economist, and obviously a very extremely well-read individual and a great author. And he's also a frequent poster, and I follow him on LinkedIn and enjoy his posts. One of the posts that he made a week ago was about a a report that said that globalization is facing at least 5 different headwinds: distribution effects, national security, economic security, industrial policy, and climate change. And I'd like to ask you about that if I could. And let's start, if we could, with sort of the geopolitical, national security, and economic security issues. I was at a very interesting speech recently by Jeff Rubin, the former chief economist at CIBC World Markets. And he's written a book as well. And he was saying that sort of globalization has changed dramatically because of number one, sort of onshoring, friendshoring, that we're no longer trading the way that we did, and sanctions because of geopolitical issues. Is that consistent with the argument that Olivier Blanchard makes?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's one of the trends that he's flagged, and obviously we're living in a time of fragmentation of the global economy, growing tension, geopolitical tension. I mean, my goodness, there's a land war underway in Europe, believe it or not, that's been going on since February 2022, and Mr. Putin is threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons if the Western countries keep backing Ukraine. I mean, this isn't what we lived through 10 or 15 years ago when globalization was at its peak. China was welcomed into the World Trade Organization back in the year 2000. And there was a lot of hope and expectation that China would evolve in ways that are more aligned with the kind of Western economic and political model. That hasn't happened. China is now in the middle of I would say, a multi-decade strategic competition with the United States for global leadership. There's a trade war underway, which shows no signs of abating. You have, as you pointed out, and Ruben pointed out, a bit of a trend toward reshoring production, reducing dependence on geopolitical rivals, putting up more barriers at the border, governments spending more on industrial policy to try and promote domestic champions, a lot of skepticism about the benefits of freer trade, and the list goes on. So yeah, there are very powerful headwinds, I think, that suggest globalization has peaked, and we're now in an era maybe of kind of incremental deglobalization. This isn't a Canadian story. It's happening worldwide. We're being, we're drifting along in the currents that are really being created elsewhere.
Jeff Rubin, in his speech, took it a step farther and said that, a lot of us had blamed some of the inflation issues that we experienced over the course of the last couple of years during COVID on supply chain impacts. And he said, a lot of people think the supply chain impacts have been solved. And he said, the problem is that our supply chain has changed dramatically. We're just, because of the things that you just talked about, national security issues and economic security issues, we're just not going to be buying as much cheap goods from China as we did, or cheap resources from Russia as we did. And because of that, our products, our consumption, our natural resources are going to be more expensive in the future. And we're therefore not going to have that sort of counter-inflationary factors like we've enjoyed during the era of globalization.
Yeah, I think he's absolutely right in that argument, and I go further and say that let's use a real world example. The Americans have imposed a 100% tariff on imports of electric vehicles manufactured in China in order to prevent China from displacing American-based companies in their own market. And as part of this broader trade conflict between the US and China, Canada is now under pressure to do the same. That may or may not be a smart policy decision, but one thing for sure is it's going to make electric vehicles more expensive from the consumer's vantage point, which will slow the sort of uptake of EVs in the market and it'll have a negative effect on the cost of living, if you will.
So are you saying I could buy a electric vehicle from China in Canada at 50% of the price it is in the United States?
Well, I'm not sure. I'd have to dig into the data on that, but the U.S. intends to freeze China out of the U.S. market for electric vehicles, certainly in terms of importing a final product from China. Whether they'll prevent Chinese companies from investing in U.S. EV manufacturing facilities is a different question. But this is part of the sort of U.S.-China dynamic that's playing out now, and it puts us in a bit of a tough spot here in Canada because it's are we going to align with the United States in terms of trade policy with China? I would say we probably will, even though we might prefer to have a greater degree of latitude. But to the extent that trade conflicts proliferate, trade barriers go up, restrictions on investment expand, it's going to raise costs, the cost of consumer goods and the cost of intermediate inputs as well. And that does lead into a discussion about, inflation in the future. Maybe there'll be a structural impetus toward higher rates of inflation, just because some of the things that brought inflation down in the 1990s and the first, sort of decade or so of this century are now reversing.
I want to ask you about the fourth issue that was outlined in this paper about industrial policy. I'm not sure if you followed Fareed Zakaria at all, who writes in the Washington Post on a regular basis.
Yeah,
This past weekend, he had a really interesting article column that was arguing that Biden had been one of the most successful economic policy presidents in modern history. And he said that he had done more for the economy than anyone since FDR because of industrial policy. And he argued and he had a list of all the presidents that all they had done is reduce taxes. But that what Biden had done through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the CHIP Act, through other things that he's done is he really copied China in their industrial policy. And the paper that you were quoting about also talked about how industrial policy for a long period of time had a bad reputation, a bad name among economists. But now they're thinking about it a lot more because of the success of China and because of the success of the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIP Act, et cetera. So my question is, have people like you, your economists' attitudes changed toward industrial policy, and should the Canadian government be more interested in exercising some industrial policy?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. There are mixed views on that among economists, certainly the ones that I follow. It's a bit early to offer an appraisal of the legacy of President Biden and his kind of economic agenda. I mean, he's still in office. We need to let more time pass, I think, before we'll have the kind of facts and information that would permit a more careful consideration of the track record of the Biden administration. But it is true that there's been a much more activist U.S. industrial policy under the Biden administration than we saw before. A lot of it is triggered by concerns about national security and the competition with China. I mean, these things are linked. I would say without the perceived threat of China, the legislation you just described and that Fareed Zakaria was talking about in the Washington Post would never have been passed by the U.S. Congress. This is all against the backdrop of the strategic competition between the U.S. and China, which I think is really a very kind of powerful force out there in the world at the moment. So industrial policy has had a bit of a renaissance, and not just in the U.S., but also in Europe and in Canada. Will it deliver the goods? Will it result in greater prosperity and incomes? I really think it's too early to answer that, Brian. I'm not as enthusiastic about it as Fareed Zakaria. I think the record's much more mixed. And in the Canadian context, I'm quite dubious that multiple tens of billions of dollars of incentives and subsidies for electric vehicle manufacturing and battery plants is actually going to produce a net positive outcome for the Canadian economy. I'm very skeptical on that. Time will tell whether I'm right or whether the government is right on that.
You made a post a week ago about AI, which I want to read to everyone. A productivity boom triggered by the development and adoption of artificial intelligence may move the U.S. further ahead of other advanced economic jurisdictions on this key measure of prosperity. What do you think? Is AI that important productivity?
Well, I mean, there are varying views on that among people who study it. Certainly, there's lots of enthusiasts who believe that the artificial intelligence and other related digital technologies that are developing and maturing very quickly are going to result in a real boost for productivity down the road. We did see that in the US in particular in the 1990s where the earlier stages of the IT and computer revolution really began to deliver results in terms of higher incomes, higher productivity. The U.S. is well positioned for that because so many of the companies that are driving the digital revolution are based in the U.S. And it gives them kind of a huge advantage in that area, which is why the author of the article that I linked to was arguing that the U.S. would benefit more than other advanced economies from the AI revolution, just because they have so many of the companies that are driving the train on AI. But at the moment, it's too early to know whether the AI revolution will really kind of transform the productivity picture. It's speculative at this point. There's some evidence that it will. There's other evidence that's more skeptical. So it's not something I would offer a judgment on, but it's a key area for people who care about this to work on.
You post very frequently, and it's really quite interesting following you, sir. And I thank you for that, because and while you post, you always comment on what people have been writing, and so I find that really interesting. You had a really interesting post that said our prime age employment, people between the ages of 25 and 54, is higher than the United States, and that bodes well for Canada.
Yes, I mean, that's why I said Canada, we've got some strengths, which is why I think our competitive position is better described as mediocre rather than dismal. One of the strengths we've got, including vis-a-vis the U.S., is our education levels are actually higher in the working age population on average. And we have a higher rate of employment among people aged 25 to 59 than the U.S. does. And that was what the article that I linked to was comparing, was the U.S. versus other countries in the ratio of employment, or the proportion of people aged 24 to 59 who are actually employed. So we've been more successful, if you will, than the United States in creating an environment where employment rates are higher among prime working age people. This has to do with differences in the two countries around basic education levels. The Americans have more people with criminal records, for example, than we do on a population adjusted basis. They've got more people who are high school dropouts than we do on a population adjusted basis. They actually have more lower skilled immigrants coming into their country than we, until recently, than we've had in Canada on a population adjusted basis. So the labor force and the skills sort of embodied in the labor force in Canada is an area where I think we've got some strengths that we can use to hopefully benefit our agenda for building prosperity going forward. So that's an area where Canada's performed well.
So our employment participation rates in the prime ages are higher than the United States, but our unemployment level is higher than the United States. How do those two things coexist?
Well, the unemployment level is higher at the moment, because our economy is weaker than the U.S. economy is growing quite a bit faster than Canada now, and it has been for a couple of years. And secondly, we've had a lot more population growth than the United States on a per capita basis, because we're bringing so many people into the country. Far more. I mean, immigration in Canada is running 4, 5, 6 times the level of the U.S. and other advanced economies in the past 2 or 3 years. So the size of the potential workforce has been growing much faster in Canada, which means our unemployment rate is somewhat higher. The U.S. immigration numbers have been quite low until recently. Under Trump, they really dried up, and then COVID was, the borders were shut for a couple of years. Under Biden, there's been more immigration, but not at the level that we're seeing in Canada. So the higher population growth rate here is contributing to a somewhat weaker job market relative to the U.S., and that translates into a higher unemployment rate.
You've written quite frequently a blog for the Fraser Institute, and also columns about the importance of natural resources in Canada, and then also about the share of natural resources in the BC economy. Why do you think that's important to raise? Do you think that we're not aware of that, or do you think that governments need to pay more attention to that, or what's your argument?
Yeah, well, here I'll put on my hat as a Western Canadian, if I might, for just a moment, and I would say that uh, our political decision makers, and to some extent our, the members of our chattering classes and our academic elites and so on, are quite heavily concentrated in the Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto triangle, in that part of the country, your part of the country, natural resources don't loom as large in the overall economic portfolio as they do here in Western Canada. We have a national government at the moment that I would say is particularly oblivious to the economic realities of the Western provinces, which is where a lot of our resource industries are concentrated. So I just don't think resource development has been a priority in Ottawa in the last few years. In fact, Prime Minister Trudeau, shortly after he was elected, he went to the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. I think this was in early 2016. And he made a point of observing that while Stephen Harper, his predecessor, trumpeted Canada's natural resource strengths, Mr. Trudeau would prefer to talk about not resources, but Canada's resourcefulness. In other words, our innovative capacity, our he didn't use the term, but I think he was referring to our progressive values and our kind of woke ideology, which has become very much associated with his time as prime minister. So he almost repudiated, in front of a global audience, or downplayed the importance of the natural resource economy, which I think was a mistake then, and it's certainly a mistake now. Because resources, if you ask, how does Canada pay the bills globally? We do it by exporting, and half of our exports come out of the natural resource economy. Energy alone is a quarter of Canada's exports, and by energy, I mean primarily oil, refined petroleum products, natural gas, and what's coming at us is liquefied natural gas. Those are the big energy contributors. You don't see a lot of that in Ontario, but it's pretty important out here in the West, and it's important to Canada. And I think we need to embrace our resource wealth, see it as part of not just our past but our future, and try and be the most efficient and sustainable resource producing jurisdiction in the world. That's the aspiration that I would like to see embraced by our national government, instead of belittling the natural resource economy as sort of a sunset sector, because it's not.
We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with our guest, Jock Finlayson, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone. Really interesting conversation tonight with Jock Finlayson, a senior fellow at the Canadian Competitiveness at the Fraser Institute. Sir, you've talked about really taking a look at the tax code. You've talked about need to have more of a focus on natural resources. If you were the Minister of Finance or head of our economy, what would you be focused on?
Yeah, I think there'll be 3 or 4 areas. One is certainly modernizing our tax system, looking at ways we can design it so that it encourages investment and allows us to grow productivity in a more impressive way than we've been doing recently. I think that's imperative. Second, I would look at what I call the regulatory state. This is all the different government laws, acts, regulations, and agencies that regulate the economy, regulate industrial activity, and really try and improve our performance in those areas, especially by reducing the time it takes to get decisions on projects, on environmental permits, on constructing housing, whatever. Like right across the board, I think we need to streamline and upgrade all of our regulatory systems. And a third, in the current environment, I'd actually slow down immigration. I'm strongly supportive of a small L liberal immigration policy, but the numbers that we've been admitting are just simply too high. We can't absorb them. We can't provide housing. We're now seeing very rapidly rising unemployment rates among a lot of the temporary foreign workers who came to Canada. So we need to dial that back for a few years and make sure we've got the conditions in place where newcomers can thrive. And then above all, Brian, number one, we need to have a laser-like focus on encouraging more business investment. That's where Canada is really falling short relative to our peers, including the United States. Companies just aren't investing enough in Canada, and we need to do everything we can in the next 5 years to turn that around, or there'll be very little opportunity to grow prosperity going forward.
How do you do that? I had, one guest on that said that the strength of the housing market over the course of the last couple of years and the massive price increases attracted capital out of business investment into the real estate market. That seems to have potentially gone away right now with what's happening in the condo market in the Greater Toronto area and the Vancouver area. But how do you encourage business investment?
Well, you've got to have an environment where entrepreneurs and our out here in BC, our current government never talks about entrepreneurs. I've never heard Justin Trudeau give a speech on the importance of entrepreneurship. We're in a market economy, a capitalist economy. Entrepreneurs are at the heart of innovation, of building successful businesses. If I was in government, I would sit down on a regular basis with the most successful entrepreneurs in the country and pick their brains on what we need to do. I don't have all the answers, but that's the that's the expertise I'd be trying to tap into to basically make the policy changes where we can encourage more investment here. That's not happening. Entrepreneurs are very almost never mentioned in federal government documents, speeches. They're never touted as important. And in fact, they're actually critical. So we need to, shift course and put a much greater emphasis on improving the entrepreneurial environment. And what we're doing now is not working.
Well, I got to tell you, sir, number one, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate the conversation about competitiveness. And number two, I had the opportunity to work for a couple of years in Vancouver for Jim Pattison. And talking about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs, he's one of the best. And I had an opportunity to learn a lot from him. I also, interesting enough, given your title as the Peter Brown Chair in Canadian Competitiveness, got to enjoy a few meetings between Jimmy Pattison and Peter Brown. And so that was a very special opportunity for me to see both of them interact, as Jimmy actually made a major investment in one of Peter Brown's institutions. Jock Finlayson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity. Have a good evening.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I think that this competitiveness issue really should be one of the top agenda issues. And too often it ends up getting sort of subsumed by so many the other issues that we're focused on in today's environment. But if we don't grow the pie, if we don't actually grow our economy, we're not going to have the money left to redistribute to anyone. We're not going to have the money left to support people in their senior years. We're not going to have people that can go to school. We're not going to have the money left to support social programs that even people that are interested in those progressive social values that Jock talked about want to spend money on. And so having some competitiveness, growing the pie, getting closer to the productivity in the United States, I think are key functions that we've got to pay more attention to. So Jock Finlayson, thank you so much for raising those issues. And thank you for all your posts. That's our show for today, everybody. Good night.